faith from revelation or by reason from philosophy. So let me reread that so that we get an understanding of what's being said. The scholastics were not so much seeking truth as they were trying rationally to organize a body of accepted truth, so that truth, whether it came by faith from revelation or by reason from philosophy. So, their understanding, recognize that they're not trying to prove our faith. Right? Like they're not trying to say, oh, okay, well, now that we have this philosophy, we know that now we can prove this. No, that's not necessarily what they were intending to do. They were seeking truth, and they were trying to rationally organize. So, again, this also has a tendency to sound familiar as well. The question that they wish to settle involved whether or not the faith was reasonable. Right? So again, they're attempting to understand, attempting to gather reasons. This is the kind of apologetical ancestry derives from this period. It derives from the Testament period as well. In this period, there's a great introduction of that conceptually. And really, what this describes is systematic theology. And what we're going to come as we go into a couple of individuals that we want to talk about, we start to get into the understanding of a systematic theology. In Isaiah 28, verses 9 and 10. Whom shall he teach? Whom shall he teach knowledge? And whom shall he make to understand doctrine? Them that are weaned from the milk and drawn from the breasts. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little. Systematic theology is a discipline that attempts to organize an orderly, rational, and coherent account of the doctrines of the faith. So with that understanding, we understand the purpose of what the scholastics were attempting to do. We start to understand the framework. There was even in the early church, and I think the book doesn't necessarily bring it out, but I think it comes across as we look back and we see the early church. There was a use. Remember, we think of Christianity as this Western philosophical theology, and it is now. At the time that Christianity was founded and born, it was a sect of an Eastern religion. Right? Like it's a sect of Judaism, at least that's what it's thought to be. So how do we communicate these religious truths to others? And we see, I think, in terms of Paul specifically, many of the New Testament writers, they take aspects of Greek history and philosophy, and they use that as their tool of communication of this, what's the word, Oriental religion. Oriental just meaning this Eastern, certainly strange to the Western mind, but they take philosophy was the tool by which they used to communicate something that was strange and not easily understandable to a different mindset, if that makes sense. It's monotheism, first of all, which one thing that we know about the ancient world, they had no problem with gods in the supernatural. Like they had no problems in the belief of those things. I heard a historian say, he was talking about the historicity of the Bible, and he was referencing early church history in those times, and he said something that I thought was kind of wild at first, but it made sense when you think about it. It was like people during the early church period of history, that first 100 years or so, or even 50 years, the concept of the revelation wasn't a grand concept. Right? Like, we think about that because of our background, because of our makeup, because we are so touched by kind of the scientific revolution, and more so than just the scientific revolution, the humanistic aspects of science. Because we're touched by that, the nature of the revelation to our minds in the world today, yes, we believe it as Christians, but we recognize that for a non-Christian, that's a large step. Then, that wasn't that large a step, because there were plenty of religions that believed in some sort of rebirth, maybe reincarnation, and even resurrection. Like it wasn't far. It wasn't a huge step. There were, like I said, the belief in the supernatural is probably more than it is now. But the fact that God would die and then rise again, like that was a concept that was, you know what I mean? Like how do you communicate? And that was probably the biggest sort of aspect, a gap of belief that people had a hard time coming across. And when you look and you read Acts chapter 17, Paul goes to Marcia, and he's going through and preaching and teaching and doing it in a very philosophical way. That's within the manner of the philosophers that he's talking to. And he goes along and they're all fine until he gets to, again, the resurrection and God dying.
Yeah.
Specifically, right? And they're like, okay. Everything you said up until then sounded good. It's like, well, if that's the case, if it all sounded good up until then, how about you apply that same thing to this resurrection? But the fact that it's God being, God dying, it's like, oh, okay, well, then if your God is dead, you understand what I'm saying? So all I'm saying is, even in our earliest roots, Western philosophy was used as sort of the mode or tool of communication of these Eastern, Oriental, and somewhat strange ideas that of Judaism, but mostly of Christianity, specifically to the resurrection of Christ. There were two main schools of scholasticism, well, maybe there were more than two, but there were two main individuals at the forefront of scholastic thought. The first was Anselm, Anselm. So let's see, I believe we can find him. If you go to the section on this chart, between AD 1000 and 1500. Let's see.
Towards the bottom.
What's that?
Towards the bottom.
Towards the bottom, yes, thank you.
6,
Yep, Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, theologian, 1033 to 1111. All right, so we see him first of all. And so for his kind of school of thought, it was based upon, I believe in order that I may know. So just write that down and I'll explain it.
I believe.
I believe in order that I may know. So when I read that statement from the book about scholastics were not so much seeking truth as they were trying to rationally, or as they were trying rationally to organize a body of accepting truth. How do we come to truth? For our Anselm, belief and then knowledge. Right? So it was a revelatory understanding of how we come to truth. So truth is revealed, and as truth is revealed, I can gain more knowledge of the truth. That was his school. That was his thought pattern. We have presuppositions or proven truths. Further truths are built upon those truths, the truths that we already know. That makes sense? So, he's also kind of the progenitor. He's the person that we think of with many of the most popular apologetical arguments of today. He's kind of the pioneer. The cosmological argument. I'm going to simplify these. There's probably more to them, but for our purposes, the cosmological argument, God is the first cause or uncaused cause of the universe. When we talk mainly, or when we're providing an apologetic, we're talking to non-Christians about our faith. The cosmological argument is often used when we're talking about maybe the origin of the universe, the origin of man, and we talk about causality. We talk about God as the uncaused cause or the first cause. That's the cosmological argument. That, with Anselm, is a revelatory type of truth. There's truth that's revealed, and as there's truth that's revealed, we can get to that more. The other type of argument is the ontological argument that he's considered the pioneer of. And again, this deals in a revelatory type of truth. The things that we know to be true inform us and allow us to draw conclusions as to what also must be true. Does that make sense? So there are things that we know to be true. And those things inform us and allow us to draw conclusions as to what also must be true. And the argument that's kind of formed, that is kind of, Anselm was kind of known for in the ontological discourses, God is that than which a greater cannot be conceived. Right, so within that ontological argument, God is that than which a greater cannot be conceived. The point that is getting at is within our natural minds, if we conceive of the great and the perfect, and we cannot go beyond that which is of God, which is, and it gets more into kind of the Platonic and Socratic philosophical structures of Aristotle as well. I believe Socrates, Plato. Plato has the Republic. The Republic is, well, it's a book, but it's mainly like a play written, where the two main characters are attempting to make a great city. And in order to make a great city, they have to conceptualize things and they have to take the things that they see and they say, if we're going to make a city that is great and that is after the heart of who God must be, these are the things that the city must have. And likewise, when you apply a similar argument to that of who God is based upon our conception of the perfect, or of our conception of that which cannot be improved. So Anselm was a kind of a giant of that time period. The other main individual at the forefront of scholasticism was Thomas Aquinas. Now, if we go in our chart, the red dot on the following column, the second red dot, Thomas Aquinas, the most influential medieval theologian, writes Summa Theologica in 1255. So, and we'll get to his writing, but Thomas Aquinas is kind of a big deal. And I wanted to kind of touch on him just for our own purposes. So he said, with Anselm, I believe in order that I may know. For Thomas Aquinas, reason precedes revelation as a means of knowledge, but is completed by revelation. So again, we'll go back to that, to what we read at the beginning, that the scholastics were not so much seeking truth. They both believed that truth was attainable and that the truth existed already in the faith. So they weren't seeking truth. They believed that they already had it. But they were trying to rationally, it was an attempt to rationally organize a body of accepted truth so that truth, whether it came by faith, which would be more Anselm's realm, or whether it came by faith from revelation or by reason from philosophy. Reason from philosophy would be more in the line of Thomas Aquinas. But again, recognize that we say reason precedes revelation as a means of knowledge, but is completed by revelation. So recognize that revelatory truth is still a part of what it is that he believes. So yes, the Summa Theologica, or the summary of theology, which is really Aquinas' attempt to synthesize faith and reason into a totality of truth. Right? So we mentioned systematic theology. And that's really what the summary of theology is. It is kind of, I won't say it's the first, because even then, there's nothing new under the sun. But it was kind of an ordeal that was, it was a major ordeal in the fact that he was, again, synthesizing philosophy and faith in his attempt to explain the doctrines of the church. And his thought was, in synthesizing faith and reason, since both are of God, there could be no contradiction between the two. That's his thought. So his attempt at synthesizing them would just attempt to, how does this inform this? How does this inform this? What can I take from both of these things? Or how can I use philosophy to inform my faith? How can I use revealed truth to understand philosophy and reason? So again, there's this interdependence that he sees between those two things. He also wrote the Summa contra Gentiles, the summary against the Gentiles. And it was an apologetic for missionaries, but specifically for missionaries to the Muslims. So those were his two great works, the two things that he's known for as far as his writings are concerned. But the I gotta read the words that I wrote. The pedagogical foundation in scholasticism is deductive reasoning. What does that mean? Conclusions are drawn from a general premise. The book says the deductive thinker starts with a general truth or law that he does not prove, but that he takes for granted. You understand? So this isn't, this is true, right? I talked about presuppositions, I talked about proven truths or understood truths, a priori truths, things that are true because they are true. I believe that this is true. Now that I believe that this is true, conclusions are drawn from a general premise or an assumed or proven truth and applied. Right, so kindergarten, when we teach how to recognize numbers. First grade, when we teach how to do addition and subtraction. Second and third grade, and forever, we teach how to do either multiple numbers. Eventually, we learn our times tables, factors, all these other terms. And then to eventually, now, we can get to the point where we can define. We've gone from the general to the specific. That's a scholastic process. Even in our university, even in the university system, what do? We start off with a core group of classes, and these core group of classes are general knowledge classes. Everybody takes this. Basically, everybody takes the same general knowledge classes because they're general. And as you go along more into your field of study, it gets more specific. Well, that's the nature of scholasticism, right? And that's also the nature of Isaiah 28:10. For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little and there a little. Right? Like that's that same concept. How do we learn? How do we learn doctrine? Precept upon precept, line upon line, here a little there a little. We start with the general truth. We gain more, learn a little bit upon a little. Precept upon precept, truth upon truth, line upon line, here a little and there a little. It should also be recognized that when we talk about Anselm, when we talk about Aquinas, and as such, their teachings mostly serve to reinforce the sacramental system. So while I said, and it's true, and we recognize the need and the use that this type of study had in helping us comprehend doctrine. The Summa Theologica is the first, not the first, but one of the major undertakings by someone in the church to provide a systematic theological community. So that was an aspect of it, but also they used their teachings to reinforce the sacramental system. They used it to reinforce the hierarchical system of the Roman Catholic Church. It led to the subordination of the individual to the institution. Salvation came via the sacraments of the church, the Roman Church. And the church was the initiator of the sacraments. So what does that mean? Salvation came via the sacraments. And the sacraments came via the church. What does that mean? Where does salvation come from? Church. Salvation comes from the sacraments. Sacraments can only be given by the church. Therefore, the church has all of the people. Their salvation is held by the church. Nevertheless, those are all biblically based. Dogmas, which may have a biblical foundation at times, but they are church, they tend to be church tradition. The traditional teaching about the church, specific to its authority. So that's a lot of what it was used for. It was used to kind of reinforce church dogma, while also being there as a theological, or to provide a summary of theology. So just going over some of the pre-reformers, because when we think about the Reformation, this isn't something that just happened overnight. It isn't something that just, oh wow, I didn't realize. No, like these were, the reformers had other people that they looked to, and they were like, well, I like what this guy said. One of those individuals was John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe we would consider sort of a pre-reformer in that he lived prior to the Reformation period. Let's find him. I think he's on this same line. Yep. Second red bubble, right down, well, it's not second, but the red bubble after Thomas Aquinas. And what we read about him sounds very reformational, right? John Wycliffe proposes limits to papal authority and that the Bible should be available to people in their own language. And this is 1371. So the Reformation doesn't occur, doesn't pop off until 1517 with Martin Luther and the 95 Theses. And this is 150 years before that, roughly. And he's saying very similar things. Wycliffe, after 1379, began to oppose the dogma of the Roman Church with revolutionary ideas. He attacked the authority of the Pope in 1379 by insisting in writing that Christ and not the Pope was the head of the Church. He asserted that the Bible instead of the Church was the sole authority for the believer and that the Church should model itself after the pattern of the New Testament. This is 1379-ish. So my point is, this is, one, it's incredibly courageous to say at that time. But two, and the book mentions and calls it a revolutionary idea. From our mindset, that doesn't seem revolutionary. But this is 1379, right? Like, I love how people say, I can't believe we're doing this in 2025. It's like, well, I mean, last year was 2024. We were doing it then, too. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, but 1379, like, this is a revolutionary idea. You know, for about a millennia, and specifically for roughly 300 years or so, papal authority, and not only papal authority, but papal supremacy has been kind of the norm. Not kind of the norm, it has been the norm. So Wycliffe was English, by the way. Wycliffe, opposing church dogmas, as we mentioned already, that, you know, a lot of the scholastics used their teaching to reinforce church dogmas. He began to oppose the dogma of the church, attack the authority of the Pope, and then this big one, the Bible instead of the, well, I guess both of them are pretty big. Christ and not the Pope was the head of the church, which sounds unbelievably simplistic to us now. And I'm sure, at least in our perspective, the New Testament church would say, yeah, what else would there be? But to the church at that time, the church that existed at that time, this was a big deal. And then asserted that the Bible instead of the church was the sole authority for believers. Another thing that's big and that's huge, we've mentioned the fact that, you know, Bibles weren't as they are now, you know, so available as to be, you know, almost a foregone conclusion. Like, if you want a Bible, you can get a Bible. Yeah, anywhere. You know, if you steal a Bible from a church or from a hotel, like, I mean, yeah, that's one way of getting it, but nobody really bats an eye. You know what I mean? Like, it's, okay, we'll replace the Bible. It's not that big a deal. In fact, you come to a church, it's like, can I have a Bible? It's like, yeah, like, yes. Like, you know what I mean? But at that time, having a Bible was just not a reality. It wasn't something that people had ease of access to. And because there wasn't ease of access to, these were things that we mentioned the monastery and the monastic systems and convents. Bibles were available for the educated and those that were going through, be it seminary or instruction to become part of the clergy. It was available to them, but it wasn't available to the laity. And we start to kind of get an understanding of why and how the church can say, okay, no, it's up to the clergy and specifically, or ultimately that of the Pope, to interpret these things for the laity. One, they didn't have the Bible available to them. Two, even if they did, the vast majority of them couldn't read anyway.
And 3, let's say they had the Bible, let's say they could read. Can they, like, people now can't understand the Bible. Like, even then, it would have been very difficult for them to understand. But this went along, and the church did resist, number one, that doctrine, and number 2, the Bible for the laity. Now, there were, I would say, quote, good and bad reasons for that. Again, from our perspective, we tend to see we tend to promote the bad part more than we attempt to see kind of the quote-unquote good intentions. But their reasoning behind that was kind of what we laid out. So you want to give a bunch of poor, illiterate people a Bible, and then what? They're going to latch on to a verse and use that to define their lives and take things out of context if they even can read, or they're going to go to somebody that can read and they'll be able to read every fourth word. Granted that they can find a Bible that's written in their language, which all the Bibles that were written and taught for the clergy were written in Latin, because the Mass was in Latin. So, yeah, fine, great. You're Swede, you're German. It's like, okay, fine. You want to be a part of the clergy? Learn Latin, read the Bible. You're part of the laity? Well, learn Latin and come to church. And then the Bible will be taught to you. So anyway, I wanted to bring up Wycliffe because he's an important pre-Reformation figure. And also, we start to get what's called biblical humanism. We oftentimes today, we hear humanism and we shy away because most of the time the humanism that is talked about today is secular humanism. But like many things, before there was secular humanism, there was biblical humanism. Biblical humanism is much more focused on the individual over the institution. That's the humanistic part of it. And the biblical part is self-explanatory. It's rooted in the Bible. So, along with the pre-Reformation kind of mindset, biblical humanist, along with textualism, individualism, and exegesis, those began to grow in importance as to the authority of the Bible, and the New Testament doctrine began being emphasized over church dogma. Right, so from a pre-Reformational standpoint, we're starting to get these things. We're starting to get, biblical humanism, a focus on the individual as to that of the organization or the church as as an organism or as as an institution. That's the better word. Textualism, which is a form of studying the text, which up until this point was only done in the monasteries and the seminaries. And then exegesis, which makes its kind of reintroduces itself by many of the kind of German monks, who, if you think now, I think many of the Orthodox and Catholic individuals, they look back and they say, yeah, well, it was always the Germans that were causing trouble for the Orthodox position. And to some extent, there's some truth in that. I mean, there's been 2 world wars in history, and wouldn't you know it, the same country was the start of both of them. But so there's a level of German. There seems to be a going their own way with Germany a lot of times, and an individuality that's geared up for some reason in the German mindset. So I just find that interesting. So let's take a break before we get into the second part of class.